I'd like to first acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional territories that have been tended and defended for centuries by the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, as a reminder of whose resistance we must live in the footsteps of. Can we start? Let's start. I ask you, how do you sleep at night? You lean back and say, I sleep well, my conscience is quiet. I ask, what do you see in the plans we're looking at right now? You answer, in the drawings I organize all the functions the client wants to see, so as to minimize the things we don't want to see. I always say, there's no ideal, only the optimal. I do the best possible job within the constraints. I ask, what about the architect's role in shaping society? You get up and answer, architects usually have big egos. They think they're walking 3 feet above the ground. But a good architect needs to be part of an orchestra in which everyone has a part that they have to play. You have to be modest and not be too concerned with ideals or building a great monument to yourself. Look, they come to me because they can turn X to Y in the fastest time. That's the architect's job. Finally, I mentioned the thorny connection between architecture, politics, and private capital. Architecture has always been connected to big money and political power, but you shouldn't be concerned with that too much. Listen, if you choose to do art, do art. Leave politics to the politicians. Hi, my name is Tings Chak, or Tsak Thing Guan. I'm sharing with you a series of drawings I did about immigration detention centers, or a generic detention center reconstructed architecturally of places that are typically hidden from view. And what I read was an excerpt of an interview done by Israeli artist Nir Evron, where he interviews a well-known but unnamed architect of the Nahal Raviv migrant detention facility in Israel. And why I started with this is that it highlights some of the key questions and tensions that I've been exploring over the last few years as an artist trained in architecture, but also as a migrant justice organizer in this city for some years, primarily through known as Legal Toronto and the End Immigration Detention Network, working alongside undocumented and incarcerated migrants. One of the questions that I've been exploring is the role of architectural design in migrant detention, or the prison industrial complex, more broadly speaking. Immigration detention is the fastest growing incarceration sector in North America. Despite the breadth and scope of this industry, the sites, the buildings, and the people held within the detention centers are largely invisibilized. Just as the people detained are without papers, so are the buildings. Without photos, drawings, and tucked away from public view, these buildings too are undocumented. On September 17, 2013, just as I was starting my last semester of my architecture master's, 191 migrants in detention took on the largest known hunger strike inside detention. Many were jailed for months and years without charges or trial and with no end in sight. They are among the 100,000 people in Canada that have been targeted by police and immigration enforcement because they are Black and brown working class people who speak the wrong accent, who are born in the wrong places. And that protest that began 4 years ago to protest their prison conditions grew into an ongoing campaign to end indefinite immigration detention and immigration detention at large. Much of what I'm sharing with you today comes from that collective organizing experience through an immigration detention network. While we organized quite tirelessly on the inside and outside, I began asking the question, how does the criminalization of migrants take form in our built environment? What does the prison industrial complex look like in material terms, and who upholds it? From the detail of the doorknob to the master plan of the prison facility, decisions are made at every level, and people make those decisions. So what does it mean to be an abolitionist architect? Well, trying to bring the immigration detention into architectural conversation, one is faced with many challenges. Like supermarkets, strip malls, parking lots, detention centers are seen as, not seen as architecture, capital A architecture, but as spatial byproducts, necessary constructions that are beneath architectural consideration. Or where it is discussed, architects are only interested in designing more innovative, more humane, or even more green spaces, perhaps ones where even sheep can graze in the yard. And this is a real, award-winning Danish state prison proposal. Just as we can't imagine a world without capitalism, architects are saying we can't imagine a world without prisons. Rather than critiquing the violent capitalist system itself, architecture is used as a tool to minimize or moderate violence at best and to justify violence at worst. When the solution is no longer a building at all, but the absence of one, then it is no longer seen as an architectural problem. When faced with the criticism of the 882 migrant worker deaths, and this number is from a couple of years ago, for the construction of the 2022 Qatar World Cup Stadium, the late Zaha Hadid infamously responded, "I have nothing to do with the workers. It is not my duty as an architect to look at it." So what is the responsibility of an architect and anyone who participates in the construction and design of buildings that are used as tools of state violence and exploitation? These questions and years of organizing culminated in the book, Undocumented, The Architecture of Migrant Detention, a graphic novel or architectural documentary that uses the architectural tools that I learned, like the plan, the section, the diagram, as political tools for representing, documenting, and bearing witness to the incarceration system. How can drawings of hidden away spaces amplify the organizing experiences led by detainees and supported by movements on the outside that I've been a part of? I'm going to end with an excerpt from this. There are billions of dollars made in the incarceration of human bodies. There are a lot of hands involved in this industry, but there aren't many faces. In these authorless spaces, we hide the casualties of poverty and displacement. We even try to hide the spaces themselves. It is a tyranny without a tyrant, where nobody rules and we are all equally powerless. Status is a fickle thing. It can be taken away from you at any moment, and it can be lost. It determines your rights, your identity, your access, your freedom. Your place of birth has nothing to do with the treachery of borders violently imposed onto our bodies, between our families, and throughout the places we call home. There is an immigration detainee on hunger strike for over 60 days in protest of indefinite detention. Held for 28 months in a maximum security prison without charge or trial, he said, "I missed 3 of my son's birthdays. I missed 3 anniversaries with my wife. Cannot see myself here detained indefinitely and thinking about them. That will drive me crazy. I am a father and I'm a husband. Should I even be allowed to feel like this?" He was put in segregation. The modern cell is based on the idea of the modern individual, the minimum social unit to which everything is scaled, from an automobile to the micro-condominium, the secure housing unit to the hospital cubicle. Our bodies are standardized and our needs quantified. The minimum habitable space for an incarcerated individual is measured: 2 square meters of floor area, 3.5 cubic meters of airspace. In this volume, the contents of your life are caged. But not every human action can be programmed or predicted. Our bodies always find ways to carve out space, to refocus our attention from the geometry to the lived experience, from the container to the contained. Just as architecture sets limits to the body and its possible inhabitation, the body sets limits to architecture's ambitions. In Violence of Architecture, Bernard Schumi describes a kitchen as a space for cooking and eating. Yet it can also be a space for sleeping and making love. This he calls programmatic violence. On September 17th, 2013, 191 detainees in Lindsay, Ontario, took the largest known hunger strike among immigration detainees. They refused to go into their cells. They refuse to eat their meals. Their detention refused to demand an end to immigration detention. Some have been held for nearly a decade in maximum security prison without charge or trial. One of the detainees, who was on hunger strike for over 60 days, said, "Whatever it takes, we will do it." Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really extraordinary. I'm still recovering from that, and I want to ask you about the impact of your work outside the realm of architecture and art. But I was reminded while you were talking about something that Coco and I discussed before our talk that we didn't have the opportunity to bring, which is how the notion of panopticon, which I'm sure you have in mind talking about prisons, that serve as a way of addressing the overwhelming presence of the state in Cuban's life. No? And I thought about that because in that sense, the prison and the possibility of incarceration is contextualized in a way in which individuals can contribute to this, no? In contrast to the invisibility that you are talking us about, no? that your work is trying to highlight. And in a way, both cases need the complacency of individuals. No? One, to make it open, that the state has eyes and ears everywhere. But in your case, in the case that you are exposing for us here, is in the silent, no? The complacency in the silence of these individuals. And I wanted to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit more on how what you see in your, what you present in your novel can actually bring awareness to people beyond this sphere in which we are now.
Yeah, I think one of the things around, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a self-criticism around this project, is that in focusing on the buildings themselves, one thing that gets lost is how incarceration isn't just at the sites, especially for people of precarious status who are the targets of immigration enforcement, is that it's in our communities everywhere. It can be at a public library, it can be at a public pool, it can be at a food bank. All these potential sites are sites of potential incarceration. And so there are people, and especially with the people who have been organizing for many years on the ground, for instance with No One Is Illegal in Toronto, around bringing light to the fact that there are people at these sites and they're choosing whether or not to enforce immigration law or not, play the role of a border guard, essentially, when you're denying someone access to a public service on the basis of immigration status. And at worst, reporting that to immigration officials or to the police that someone is undocumented. So that's been a long, long struggle for the last decade or more in the city around that. So I think that's hopefully something that we can shed light on, is that detention is not only at these sites, but in our communities, in every space we think of as public.
And in a way, I was thinking also in what Carlos was mentioning before, no? Thinking about immigration in a different manner, no? And your work does that, thinking in terms of how, as you were saying before, the architecture affect the life of this migrant. And I wondered if you can elaborate a little bit more on that point.
Around the way the architecture
affect the life of the migrant.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to try to highlight in this project is not only the ways that architecture is oppressive, is used as a tool of oppression to dehumanize, to lock away, and to separate people violently from their families and communities, but also that people are constantly contesting the architecture itself by acts of protest, individual acts of protest, to organize mass protests. And that is what I wanted to highlight. And also what I think we should highlight in terms of resistance, that though it's hard to see inside prison cells, people are resisting on a daily basis.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.